Hello, everyone. We've added this note to the beginning of all of our original episodes of the podcast to let you know of a few changes that have happened around here and hopefully avoid any confusion for you as listeners. When we began this podcast, it was called Starseed Survival Guide, and most people called me, your host, by my birth name, Erin. Throughout the first 22 episodes, you'll hear me introduce myself as Erin, hear others refer to me as Erin, and hear many references to the name of the show being Starseed Survival Guide. In 2018, more and more folks began calling us Yaya, and in March of 2020, we changed the name of this podcast to Earthside Survival Guide to more accurately reflect our intentions for the show. For a little more of the full story of what these changes mean to us, please check out episode 23, a temple talk where we reflect on where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. We thank you for your patience during this transition, for listening and sharing this journey with us, and most importantly, for allowing us to continue to grow and evolve. Blessings.
And as I call in the east, I walk into the stream. And as I call in the south, I bring water to my mouth. And as I call in the west, the creek swallows my chest. And as I call in the north, I am swallowed by her source.
Greetings, Starseeds, and welcome to the Starseed Survival Guide podcast. I'll be your host, Erin Rivera Merriman, and I'm honored to facilitate a place for us to virtually gather to be seeded, activated, and germinated by the infinite well of galactic and terrestrial wisdom that is available to all in every moment. Thank you for hearing the call, for remembering that there is so very much more to life, and showing up to explore the secret, esoteric, mystical, and unorthodox pathways to liberation that are and forever will be open to you and all who seek them with sincerity. We welcome and hail to the guardians and the gatekeepers who dwell eternally in the liminal realms. We humbly beseech your assistance today in opening these portals between the dimensions so that those who have tuned in with this transmission may find themselves able to listen from a deeper place and receive the hybrid medicine and restructuring that the helper spirits who called this broadcast into being so generously provide. May you as sacred listeners hear what you need to hear and discard anything that is not of value to your own stated intentions for your life and the fulfillment of your soul's purpose in the most enjoyable, most beautiful possible way. Starseed Survival Guide is a listener-supported program, and we hope that if you find value in the experience we share here today, that you might consider offering support by visiting us online at www.activeculturefamily.com and making a purchase or donation. Many blessings to you on your journey, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hi folks, it's me, Erin, and I'm here today with feminist shamanic healer, author, scholar, and wisdom teacher Vicki Noble. Vicki is the author of several books, including Shakti Woman, Feeling Our Fire, Healing Our World, and The Double Goddess, Women Sharing Power. Vicki taught in the Women's Spirituality Graduate Program at New College in San Francisco, lectures internationally, and has led tours of women on pilgrimage to sacred goddess sites around the world. She's also one of the creatresses behind the celebrated Motherpeace Tarot and currently shares her teachings in private practice with women in Santa Cruz, California. Welcome, Vicki. I'm so honored by your yes to being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I consider your research, writing, and teachings in women's spirituality to be the foundation on which so many other leaders in the field were able to stack their contributions to womankind. I'm wondering if you would briefly share a little bit of your personal story of how you came to be such an impactful voice in the conversation.
Thank you. That makes me think of an anthology I edited recently, which I might just bring in at this moment so I don't forget. because my opening in the 70s in California to the goddess and to shamanism and yoga and all the significant psychic experiences that happened for me at that time, it was really part of a much larger picture, which I wasn't exactly aware of at the time, but figured out later. We were part of a movement that was spontaneously erupting out of the women's movement, but it was a goddess movement, women-centered and goddess-centered spirituality. And, it completely blew me open in ways that I was not necessarily prepared for at the time. And I wrote a lot about those experiences in my book, Shakti Woman, because I had the feeling at the time that if I, a girl who grew up in Iowa with no particular intellectual or spiritual training, could awaken in such powerful ways to the invisible forces and the healing forces, then anyone could. Certainly, if I could, any woman could. And so on that basis, I wrote Shakti Woman as a kind of a handbook for women who are opening into the Kundalini energies and the psychic energies. Later, I came to understand that there's also the component of reincarnation and how we continue in some sense in each lifetime to develop and further the knowledge and the healing abilities and whatever else we bring into each incarnation. And so then I thought, well, there is a specialization in it, the way there is in so many indigenous cultures for shaman women, shaman people, that there is a kind of a calling, and it's particular, and it has a certain backlog, I guess you would say, of talent, a foundation of skill that comes in somehow with us and awakens when it's time. Even for, a white woman living in Western patriarchal culture. And so I still believe that if that could happen for me, it could happen for anyone. But I'm a little more aware of the complexities and how some of us are called to healing and to service, and others are called to other things, obviously. But it was a thrilling time, the late 70s in Berkeley, California. Karen and I lived with my daughters in a house that we turned into a temple, and we didn't have jobs. We wanted to write books, is what we thought. And through a series of coincidences and lovely synchronicities and unexpected events, we ended up drawing the images for the Motherpeace Tarot cards. And that, of course, was like a stepping stone into all the work I've done for the last 40 years. Wonderful time, the 70s. And that was some of the impetus for my friend Miriam Robbins Dexter and I. When we were invited to do an anthology by her publisher, we decided to do not a goddess anthology, which had already been done so well by Pat Monahan, but to ask the women who had been at the same moment in my history, developing their spontaneous contributions to the goddess movement and women's spirituality. It was such an inspiring time. And there was so much freedom in it, and the kind of joie de vivre that arose, in our lives from that moment that opened for us was thrilling. And I wanted to somehow help women your age, for example, to have that history in our own words. And so Miriam and I invited more than 30 women from that time period to tell their stories, to tell their personal stories. We asked them each 4 questions, and they responded with their own stories. And it made for a beautiful book that gives a sense of what that movement was really about, because we're quite marginalized now.
What is the name of the book you're holding up? It sounds amazing.
It's called Four Mothers of the Women's Spirituality Movement, Elders and Visionaries.
I'm going to buy that like the minute we get
I
off the
hope
phone.
so. I hope so. It's really a lovely book. You know, we did receive a little criticism right in the beginning through one of the women's spirituality programs about the lack of diversity among the writers, and it's true. And I even spoke to it in my introduction, because in the 70s, when we were piecing together the beginnings of this movement, women of color were doing other things and weren't necessarily interested in being associated with the goddess at that time and what we were doing. So it's a bit problematic because, of course, nowadays, thrillingly, the goddess movement, the women's spirituality movement, is quite diverse. And there are all kinds of women from all kinds of places and cultures in the world who are participating in it, which is absolutely amazing. But that wasn't what I was trying to do with the book. And so it's a little complicated, and I don't really know how to change it, because the earliest books about goddess work and women's spirituality by women of color did come a couple of decades later. So I totally honor and always have honored, especially Indigenous women. My work and the Motherpeace cards have such a deep connection to Indigenous women and women of color. In fact, in the Motherpeace cards, more than half of the images are women of color.
Yeah, I think that you're speaking to a few dynamics that feel very alive for me and the communities I'm a part of right now, where we are creating spaces and experiences for people to come together on the basis of the underlying commonalities between traditions and cultures and backgrounds, and yet challenged to somehow communicate about the offering in such a way that makes all different kinds of women feel welcome there. But then the work that we're doing there in the end is not about these different cultures and saying, you're welcome here too, you're welcome here too, you're welcome here too, because we're really just wanting to have that experience of what we all share as women.
Yes, and that's so complex in the modern day, because the academic feminists have gone in quite another direction.
Yes.
And see that as essentialist and unreal in some way. And so all the more important that we have bonded with Indigenous women, because they aren't essentialist, but they do honor women and believe themselves to be connected to Mother Earth in a very primal way, which is our approach as well. You know, one of the ways that I've been very blessed in the last 15 years or so is that there is now quite an active international matriarchal studies movement. And that movement was very exciting for me to come into in 2003 when I went to the first conference, because as a feminist activist woman and teacher, a white woman, but also a shaman, and also working with Tibetan Buddhist practices, you know, all these different cultural braiding that was going on in my life, as I came into the context of this international movement, there were Indigenous women brought from all over the world, different places where there are still active living matriarchal cultures. And of course, they mirrored back to me that everything I had perceived from the time of the Motherpeace all the way through to my current writings was in fact their paradigm. And so that was just very wonderful for me to have that integration, and seemed to be also beneficial for them to have us, academic women or scholarly women, talking about their cultures as such good models for the way that we should be living in the world, just at the time when their cultures are being so marginalized by globalism and capitalism, you know, and they're made to feel quite marginal and old-fashioned and out of touch and all that kind of thing, just like we are. And so the coming together has really been quite fabulous. And a couple of books have come out of those conferences. Maybe your people would want to know. One is called Societies of Peace. It's an edited anthology of papers from the conferences. And the other one is called Women and the Gift Economy. And it's also a collection of talks that were given at these conferences. So there's now a body of work, you know, to support some of these ideas that the Western society would love to keep marginalizing. Even though if we don't come back to this Mother Earth connection, and very soon, it's over for all of us.
Right.
Know? And the indigenous people know that and have been saying that for a long time. And we've been saying it in our movement for 30 years. So, you know, we are in agreement.
Yeah. I like how you're mentioning that in your travels, you really have actually encountered groups of people who you're able to have a face-to-face interaction with that say thank you for acknowledging this, and that there's a reciprocal acknowledging happening there. Because I definitely think that when people first come into goddess-based spirituality, there's a feeling that it's like fantasy, and I'll even hear some scholars say, you know, in the fictitious time where the goddess ruled, you know, say things like that in a very authoritative way with a lot of research to back it up. And so it kind of cuts through a lot to be like, well, you can write down whatever you want, but here's a group of people who is alive that has been living this way. So yeah, it's pretty real.
I would add to that the critics of our movement who say it's a fantasy and all that mostly haven't read our work. And the critics of, for instance, Maria Gimbutas, the great scientist, archaeologist who documented the goddess cultures in old Europe, they haven't read her work either. You know? And so the criticisms don't come from a depth of research. They actually come from the opposite place, a kind of glib assumption that it's all made up. And this is an ongoing aggravation in my life. It happens over and over again. For instance, it happens a lot these days that agriculture is put down as being the original problem, let's say. There's a kind of glamorization of early hunter-gatherers, and then people are this is an idea that comes from nowhere, you know, somebody made it up, that when agriculture started, that was the beginning of patriarchy. So they say 10,000 years of patriarchy, and they say agriculture was all about private property and ownership, and it ruined everything. And, you know, it effectively erases the 5,000 years of successful, sustainable agriculture that our foremothers practiced in these goddess civilizations, and that indigenous people practice still all over the world. It just erased all of that. And at the same time, that idea also erased our 30 years of work and research and books that no one reads, you know. So it's so aggravating. And I try to stay balanced in the face of it. But really, the idea that scholarship happens in the academy, this is bothering my throat, and not outside of the academy is a false idea. Some of the most, the freshest and most original and most truthful research, of course, does happen outside of the academy where there's no doctrine.
Yes, I think that I see that happen a lot, just not just with authors, but with teachers and criticism of their work. That's coming from people that haven't experienced what they're doing. They haven't experienced their teaching. They haven't experienced their healing and the perspective of the people that they're helping. And they're getting, long critical articles written based on, a photo somewhere that someone saw, and some critical examination of a cell phone photo.
And what I was saying before about the 70s being such an open and supportive time, that it wasn't just our movement, of course, it was all kinds of ways that people were very open-minded in the 70s, and the culture itself was interested and supported our work. And in fact, we were published, and we had a whole infrastructure, as you probably know, of women's bookstores and publishers and distributors and venues, for sharing our work and so on. And of course, the backlash to that has happened over the last 30 or 40 years has been very intense. We're seeing it peak now with our current government and all of the different ways in which capitalism has gone so global, and the multinationals are so powerful. And so we are just one of many groups that have been pushed aside or pushed out, and whose wisdom is kind of erased, or there's an attempt to erase.
Yeah, I felt something in me light up when you were speaking about that time, and the joie de vivre and the supportiveness, because I think that people that can get really passionate about these things, and then passion, in my experience, it can kind of it can turn to a seriousness that, it has its place, but I've been drawn more lately to people who seem like they have passion, and they're part of this eternal wave. They're jumping on this wave that you were a part of, and that's has moved through time and carried this knowing, this feminine way of knowing and being across time, but who are like, seem to be having a good time doing it, or know that it's okay to enjoy the journey.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's what I really wanted to share in some way through the anthology, was what a good time we had. We were wild, we broke the mold, and it was a thrilling experience to be out of the box in that way. And it was, and we left so many things behind, at least as women of some privilege, white privilege at least, we used that privilege in a certain way to leave behind the church, to leave behind our husbands, to leave behind, heteronormativity and patriarchal ways of being. We just said, we don't need that, and we're not doing that anymore. And we created our own forms. And it was so exciting for probably about 20 years. And then with the corporatization of publishing and other things in the 90s, it was a little bit of a losing battle. We don't quite have what it takes to, fight Rupert Murdoch's money.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned, I think twice now, this idea of the new things coming in, the new forms, the creating your own ways, because part of why I'm attracted to your work is that I do really resonate with this kind of like spiritual, mystical, inner activism. And so a sense of working one-on-one with women still being really important, even if there's a feeling like there's so much to do, or we need to reach more people, that it's like, when you really actually land a new paradigm, like within a new paradigm awakens within one person, like that
is going to spread. And so like my personal passionate belief that that is important and that matters, and just seeing that voice not be spoken to as much in this particular moment, because the real like political activism of marches and whatever, which is also really important, it's just not, it's not my path. And I've had to do a little bit of work to just accept that it makes my body very unhappy to be, you know, marching for days, and that then I'm not helpful to anybody because I feel despair. So within that, where I'm kind of just honoring you and the women like you and your contributions, because it feels like, yeah, to be perfectly honest, it feels like validation that it's okay to be a spiritual mystical activist, and some of that might be invisible to other people, but I know my intentions, and it's what feels most meaningful to me.
Uh-huh.
And then within that group, I see well, maybe I'll just leave it at that, that I hope to create visibility into an archetype of mystical activist, and provide a sense of seeing to other people who are maybe running marathons in the invisible realms and not necessarily having that contribution be acknowledged as equally important. It's that all all hands on deck, all teams are needed, all dharmas welcome.
That's very interesting, because in my life, I have interacted, or even I would say I have a network, a huge network of people who are activists. Mostly they're artist activists and performers and, you know, musicians, and my whole community of close people are out in the world really in a much more dynamic way than I am. And I had to learn about myself that my contribution comes from the space you're talking about, the mystical space, you know. And so I have to have a lot of time in nature or in private in order to interact with that mystical space and then make my contribution. And my community appreciates that and utilizes me in that way, while meanwhile I can be on retreat to some extent, where I'm you know, being informed or directed in the ways that I need in order to make my transmission. And so I think that's confusing in our culture, because we're so individualized. And we think that that every individual, you know, should be doing a certain kind of thing to make their peace. And it's not really like that. We function as communities, networks, you know, of community and cooperation and inspiration. And again, that's so much what was happening in the 1970s with the women's spirituality movement. You know, we didn't all live together or anything, but we found one another and we supported one another, and we still do. And that support and that variety of the contributions that each of us makes is very important. It's part of the diversity that we talk about. And diversity is more than class and more than color and more than race. You know, it's diversity in every way, ages and, you know, where we come from.
As you're speaking, I'm getting that sensation or excitement around what has come to be my focus in my own path with goddess and goddess studies is really goddess in her collective form.
Uh-huh.
And the ways you're speaking to that, saying we're so individual in this time, and there's a sense that everybody needs to be kind of balanced meaning like everyone has to be kind of balanced within themselves and like have this part and that part, but that can feel unrealistic, you know, like balanced within a marriage where like the marriage has to have like the romance and the business partnership and the communication and the creativity all between like these two people. And then we wonder like why 60% of marriages aren't working out. And I think that it's unrealistic expectations on ourselves to be like the super mom and the business person, unrealistic expectations on our partners, on our kids, to, you know, validate us in certain ways. And that in my personal experience, that the liberation from a lot of kind of domestic suffering was moving into this paradigm of that I actually don't feel as if I can be embodying goddess the way that I want to as an individual. I feel that the size and power and beauty and variety and majesty of the goddess that is coming to me, wanting to be embodied, needs, you know, at least 8 women to come through and reveal her magic and show what she wants to be creating in the world, and would be most interested in co-creating with us. And so I saw on your website, or on some website, you're mentioning that your focus is on female lineages of healers and yoginis. And
Yes.
so I'm really studying the yoginis with your contemporary Laura Amazzoni right now, who we interviewed back in episode 4. And I was wondering if you would just talk a little bit about who the yoginis are, in your perspective and experience, how that archetypal configuration reveals itself to you, because I think that we dismiss that word as just meaning a woman who practices yoga, and we don't actually understand that that's not what is being referred to.
Right, exactly. You know, my interest in this goes way back to when I first began my specialization in the Mediterranean area. And again, focusing on old Europe, but then I began to understand that there was such a strong shamanic component to what happened in the island cultures, in the Aegean Islands and Crete and Malta in the Mediterranean, that people fled to those islands from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, and that there was a special amalgam of the female shaman or priestess that emerged in those cultures in the 3rd millennium BCE, so 5,000 years ago, and that those wild women, as they were called, the maenads, the word means wild women, and they're always discussed. What little is written has to do with their nocturnal practices together, their group practices, their brewing of fermented beverages, and their running up the mountainsides with torches in their rituals, and, you know, just the wildness. And that is the same, as I've come to understand, about the history of the yoginis in India, where the round temples are left, little stone temples from the 8th to the 10th centuries, I think, the same time as Tibetan Buddhism began. And all of those qualities of the wildness and the freedom and the being outside of any orthodoxy, and being very, very women-centered, nature-based, and earth-based, those connected for me. So I wrote a whole book about it. I'll show you, The Double Goddess. It's a little obscure, but it's a book that's still in print from Inner Traditions. And I was writing about these figurines that I started seeing in all the different museums I went to. And it was really striking. At first I thought, oh, great, a lesbian goddess image. I'm going to write a book, you know, for lesbians to worship the goddess, because lesbians hadn't been very interested in the great mother nurturing, you know, fertility image of the goddess. So that's how it started, but it didn't end there, because as I began my research and developed my ideas, I found that actually the Amazons, so-called, were said to have ruled in dual queenship. And so I think really the archetype goes way back to these two queens, you know, or these two, one managing one aspect, the invisible, and the other managing the other aspect, the more physical, the fertility aspect. So anyway, I wrote a whole book about that, and I made lots of links between the Mediterranean wild women and the yoginis in India, and my specialty, the dakinis in Tibetan Buddhism. And so, you know, they're all connected and literally connected. I actually was able to fill in the lines between the dots and show, much to my surprise, that the women in the Mediterranean were actually connected with the women in Tibet in the early days. So that's amazing. But more than that, it's this quality that you started out talking about, of the collectivity and the group process of ritual and healing. You know, there's so much, when women get together and join our energies, well, for one thing, there's just like a tremendous amount of oxytocin flowing, and our hearts are open, and we're able to join. You know, it's a very ancient propensity that we have as women to be shamanic in a natural and spontaneous way. And so that's something that is observed and acknowledged around the world, and in ancient times, but also in indigenous cultures, and also in Tantra in India, there is a natural ability that women have to go in and out of the dimensions. And when we do that together, it's extremely powerful.
Yes, I obviously agree completely. So it occurs to me that there may be some men or women listening that sounds reasonable or that resonates with, but haven't actually experienced this phenomenon that we're talking about, that many of us take for granted as part of our experience at this point. So I'd love to just go ahead and play a little bit of a recording from a recent practice group of the sort that you're speaking about. So, your name, who you serve, and your goddess that you will tonight be representing. And if you like, this is water that I'm working with for traditional Kali sadhana that's been blessed in the practice, and that you can, when you're finished, you can just bless yourself with that water in any way that makes sense to you. Would you like to begin? And we can just observe and listen or hold space in any way that feels right.
I'm in service to Gaia, this great Earth Mother. My whole life is in devotion to her and feeding her and giving back. And I'd like to call in the serpent energy, this great being that has been with me since childhood. And offer gratitude and appreciation for her gifts. And I am in devotion and in service as well to Lilith. I'd like to honor her. Divine Sovereign Goddess. I live in reverence and honor of your sacred gifts. You restore women's bodies. That which was torn to pieces, you weave back to beauty, reminding us that our innocence is in fact still intact. You lie beneath no man. You stand tall in your power and grace. You take flight with utmost integrity. You are the wild. You embodied the embodied intelligence in every cell of my body that dances in freedom, in pleasure, in truth. I exalt you, Holy One. You give me sight in the dark of night. You've helped me survive. You've activated my instinct. And just as you did, I too call upon the magic name of God in order to flee from corruption, injustice, and all that pollutes that which is sacred. You liberate man and woman. You are that courage that makes us equal. You are unapologetically beautiful and sensual. May I join your serpentine dance all the days of my life. I am in service, devotion to your essence, secret Lilith, pure divine.
And that's what I really encourage and love in my classes with women. I've been teaching in Italy for the last 10 years.
Wow.
And have a very big group of women there who are practicing seriously and coming together even when I'm not there as dakinis.
That's beautiful to hear. Because being in California, I do just mostly focus on things happening on the West Coast. So just, it feels good to get that report. Some of what you've been touching on a little bit with, the idea of like you could even say technology or method of just women coming together, that there's something intuitive that can happen that really doesn't need any initiation or permission or education to experience each other and learn directly from spirit or the earth in those spaces, and that having a real impact. But I'm kind of hearing you speaking about a particular kind of creative process, and hearing that when you're talking about how you need your time in nature and for your community to understand your role and that's how you're gonna bring your contribution. And this creative process that requires a space to be wild, to be just free of constructs. And so I am thinking about how in your book, Shakti Woman, you were mentioning that cannabis came into your life as some kind of participant in the creation of the Motherpeace deck. And my own work really focuses on the way that I experience plants desiring to be invited into the dance of our creative process. And wanting to hear how you felt that your relationship with plant medicine influenced the flavor of the deck and the flavor of what came through and the teachings that came through.
Well, I suppose because I hadn't really, I was in my 20s in the 1970s, and so marijuana was a new thing for us, and I didn't really participate until Karen and I moved to Berkeley, and I stopped smoking cigarettes and basically took up marijuana as a transfer or, a bridge. But it opened me in ways that I was, as I say, not necessarily prepared for, certainly didn't expect. And it opened all of the inner realms to me. I didn't even know I had inner realms until I was 29 and had my Saturn return in Berkeley. And it was a phenomenal experience. And I did it in a very extreme way. As I'm a triple Aries, I tend to be extreme. And I
I'm a
did it.
quadruple Aries. I just have to say, like, the Aries power happening right now is it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that pioneering energy. Well, in any event, I started using marijuana. Really, we were free, you know, Karen and I. We lived in a house together. We had a garden together. We raised my children together, and we did our collaborative scholarly research and psychic awakening journey together. And it was a temple. And in that context, I smoked in the morning before my yoga practice and all day long. And it was obviously a great contributor to the creative process opening within me. And from there, I was just free to express, and we drew pictures every day for a year when we made the deck. And neither of us had ever been artists, so it was quite a surprise. At the end of that 3-year period, I have to say, I was so blown open. My psychic channels were totally open, and I began to go out into the world a little bit to teach a little bit of yoga, a little bit of the Motherpeace, you know, a little bit of shamanism. As I began to do that, I was unable to continue with marijuana. We had to say goodbye. I still love the smell. And once in a while can use it as a, you know, medical way of going to sleep at night, but I can't get high like that anymore. It puts me out of my body. And also, I believe over the decades, they've, you know, designed the marijuana to be quite strong. It was strong in the 70s coming from Mendocino, but it's really strong now. It's too strong for me. And, but I loved it, and I appreciate very much the doorway that it opened for me. My life card from my birth numbers is the High Priestess. I am meant to have direct access to spirit.
Yeah.
And for 29 years, I didn't know that. So it was a very great gift. And I think all the plant medicine is like that. From time to time, I have, you know, appreciated a lot of the different plant medicines over my lifetime, and they've been terribly important. Terence McKenna once wrote, you know, that he thought the whole religion of the Great Mother arose out of humanity's use of I think he was talking about the magic mushroom, but he could have been talking about any of the plant medicine. It's so direct. The plants speak to us.
Yeah, I'm going to be giving a short talk at a festival this summer called The Dark Goddess and the Sacred Mushroom that really is about my experience and being shown in the dream time, shape shifting in and out of these different forms that the goddess has taken. And it really feels like being shown, see how this frequency feels, see how this frequency feels. Do you get it yet? This is same frequency. And so especially goddess in her collective form, it's a very short leap to see the connection between that and the mushrooms, how the mushrooms have the mycelium that connects them all, that's hidden in the shadows. So we're all connected in the shadows, but then above ground and in consciousness, we appear to be these different little hyphae that are just nodes on this great organism.
Yes, isn't that beautiful?
Really.
You know, my creative partner, Karen Vogel, who made the Motherpeace with me, is more of an expert in the field of plant medicine than I. And she has written some articles, and so maybe Google her and see what she's up to.
Yeah, maybe she'd like to come talk to our
yes.
audience next.
Yes.
That would be lovely. I'll just sort of cross my astral fingers on that. But I have a friend, her name's Amber Magnolia Hill, and she has a lovely business of wildcrafted herbs called Aquarian Dawn, who I first became aware of her work through a blog that she had, or first started really connecting with what she was saying and her vibe when she started this blog separate from her herbalist business that was called Sex, Death, and Psychedelics. And basically just putting forth the assertion that these are three integral aspects of the feminine experience, and that they've been wrongly relegated into the shadows of our consciousness to the detriment of our health and well-being. And so I really appreciate anytime somebody's willing to speak openly about any of those three areas of their life, because I think they're kind of ground zero, primordial, void experiences of our creativity come through when people die and we show up for it, or when we have a transcendent sexual experience, or when we have a plant come and like radically move our assemblage point in the universe. And then to end up believing that those are experiences that we shouldn't speak about, and that we might even have shame about having experienced, is so crippling.
Because they're demonized.
Yes.
As so many natural and earth-based methodologies have been. And then the way that men do shamanism so often in our modern culture is from the point of view that there's something that all of that is unnecessary, and you just, drum in the rhythm and it's enough. And I agree, we can get together as women and chant Tibetan chants, and we can get high together. Of course, there are many technologies, and none of them are bad. None of them are wrong. And there are just certain ones that the culture has decided are okay. And of course, some of that is the legalism. So now that marijuana is legal and safe in so many places in our country, people have to get over it,
Thank you. One of the great pleasures of speaking with someone such as yourself, who is in a position of eldership and has walked the road for a time, is that it seems more likely that you be unafraid to take a position. And that's really refreshing. Thank you. And for our audience, I just want to share a little bit about my process with these podcasts, where I normally talk to our guests for a couple hours because I love a good conversation, and then edit it down to about half of that. And as I set out to do that for this episode, it just felt really wrong to cut out so much quality material when we're talking to Vicki Noble, matriarchal foremother herself. So I've decided to split this podcast into 2 episodes. And so if you've enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to hear the rest of it, stay tuned for part 2. Blessings. Ed vene vestiora es vodatos dos donele moi. Ed vene vestiora es vodatos dos donele moi. Em go vodatem go gurshatos dos donele